I'm Callista,
And I'm Teresa, and this is Terrifyingly Typical True Crime.
and we actually didn't plan for this, but this episode is somewhat New Year's themed as the killer becomes a serial killer based on his twisted New Year's resolution. And we never really make New Year's resolutions because, like most of the population, they never last. So, what's the point? But we do have some things we're looking forward to.
Yeah, I feel like I think the older I get, the more I notice like companies and, now we have Instagram with the influencers and, no diss you to you if you're able to be successful doing whatever it is. But I feel kind of like everything's kind of a marketing ploy towards the first of the year, do this, be more efficient, lose weight, blah, 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 make more money. Whatever. So I get the not buying into it because it does seem kind of like it's just, something else that we're kind of supposed to follow. You know what I mean?
I do. Yeah. And it all is kind of bullshit, especially the new year, new you. Okay. Nobody's like getting a personality transplant on January 1st. Calm down.
I mean, a lot of people probably need that, but it's true. It does not, it doesn't happen. I mean, I do sometimes think that, it's a good point for people, because it is a new year to, I don't know, not like the big things, but like if somebody needs like a little push, to maybe be more efficient or organize things a little bit better, or, they had maybe that's just because I procrastinate on everything, but maybe, gee, it's I could think about that for any new month basically or any new week, but oh, it's a new year. I'm really going to do fill in the blank, but then I guess I'm just following I'm following what I just complained about. But I do see why a lot of people need that, that little push or like, oh, that's I'll wait until then kind of thing.
Yeah, no, I take that point, and I do think, I mean, as with anything, like, that mindset shift can be helpful, especially if it's for something, like, actually attainable and small instead of, like, a habit that you plan on sustaining. I just think the whole I guess, like, what you were saying with the marketing thing, the whole, like, major change thing, that it's just geared for the new year, I don't think that actually works.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and it's funny to me because, we push, I mean, I guess it kind of starts Halloween, but, not to be so, food focused, but I mean, that's kind of how a lot of things are here. So, you have Halloween and then you have Thanksgiving and, some things are about family, but a lot of it I feel like is about food. And okay. And then we have Christmas and all these traditions and all these things you should, or you're supposed to enjoy. And then January 1st, okay, new year, new you, change everything, just ignore what we've been saying. It's a little disingenuous, I guess.
Yeah, and I do think it when you were talking about the food thing, it is kind of a feast or famine mentality, which is really not healthy or helpful.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. But on that, saying that, we are planning, hopefully, some or at least planning big changes for though they probably won't happen until, January 2027. I'm sure we probably mentioned that we live in Washington State, but we plan to move overseas. We are making plans. It honestly, it's such like a I feel like sometimes it's such a pipe dream. It's such a, uh I sometimes it's hard to visualize something big even if you plan for it to actually happen, but, I'm extremely excited about that. Sometimes change is good, sometimes big change is really good, so I am definitely looking forward to that, and, yeah, not looking forward to all the planning and all the things that need to go into it. I mean, some of the stuff, but, I think that that is, like, super exciting.
Yeah, definitely. And I do hear what you're saying about it doesn't for things that are so big like that, as exciting as they are, and for all the planning that goes into it, they don't actually seem real until it's happening.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So, fingers crossed, and, though, a dream and a prayer probably isn't gonna get us there, so actual actual planning, I am, very excited about that. I just need to, temper my going down, various rabbit holes to look at different places and, a little list, and does this have all the things on my list, and what about everybody else's list? And, yeah, but it's really exciting.
It is, yes. The logistics are less exciting, but probably more important.
Yeah, that damn reality. It's true.
Okay, anything else?
I don't think so.
Alrighty then, let's get into it. We're continuing with our theme on serial killers who targeted gay men in the 90s with the man who was sensationally and rather unoriginally dubbed the Gay Slayer, Colin Ireland. On the evening of March 8th, 1993, 38-year-old Colin Ireland bypassed the camera covered front door and made his way into the Coleherne Arms via the side entrance. From the 1970s, the Earls Court district of the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea in West London has been the home of gay pubs, restaurants, discos, hotels, shops, and saunas. One such pub, the Coleherne Arms at 261 Old Brompton Road, has always been nonconformist. It began as a rather bohemian public house in 1866, regularly hosted drag acts by the 1930s, and became popular with the gay community in the mid 50s. After homosexuality was partially decriminalized with the 1967 Sexual Offenses Act, which legalized private sexual acts between men over the age of 21, but enacted harsher penalties for street offenses, it transformed into the most well known gay pub in London. Like with many pubs frequented by members of the gay community, the Coleherne Arms seem to attract a disproportionate amount of police interest, likely due to the fact that through the late 1990s, many UK police forces raided gay spaces and went after men for so much as winking at other men by arresting them on charges like soliciting and importuning, which was officially aimed at criminalizing the solicitation of sex work, but was often used to convict men for soliciting same sex sexual activity.
In the decades that followed, the Coleherne, with its horseshoe shaped bar and blacked out windows, gained popularity with the LGBTQ plus icons like Freddie Mercury, as well as with the leather scene. Having sprung up with U.S. biker gangs in the mid 20th century, the leather subculture created a space for those who wanted nothing to do with the effeminate stereotypes surrounding gay men. In embracing leather and thereby masculinity, the scene became synonymous with gay BDSM. At the Coleherne, customers would signify their preference for sadism or masochism with color coded handkerchiefs to find a suitable partner for the night. On this Monday evening in 1993, Colin was exploiting the trust Leatherman extended to others in the community by presenting himself as a top or a dominant partner. After 45-year-old Peter Walker accidentally spilled his drink on Colin and expressed his preference for masochism, Colin struck up a conversation with the Coleherne regular. Peter was a former dancer from Liverpool who was working as an assistant theater director on the City of Angels musical in the West End. He lived a quiet life with his two dogs, a black Labrador named Bessie and a white German Shepherd called Sammy. Faced with the prospect of another night in an empty bed, Peter soon left the pub with Colin. They exited through the side door and shared a cab ride back to Peter's place in Battersea, South London.
Once the pair were in Peter's apartment, Colin called the dogs into another room and shut them inside as Peter undressed. Then, Colin put on gloves, gagged Peter with a series of knotted condoms, and used a length of cord he had brought in his rucksack to secure Peter to his four-poster bed. Colin's knife and change of clothes would stay stowed away for now. Peter had no way of knowing that the man he had taken home hadn't packed his bag for a night of consensual BDSM. He had been fitting his murder kit with the tools he would need to subdue his target and avoid detection. Colin beat and whipped Peter with his fists, a dog leash, and a belt. But the violence turned from standard to severe when Colin left the room and came back from the kitchen with a plastic shopping bag. He pulled the plastic bag over Peter's head, and only once he neared suffocation did Colin yank the bag away. Horrifically, Colin waited for Peter to catch his breath. Then he put the bag back over his head.
What a sicko.
Truly. He did this over and over again until Peter asked if he was going to die. Colin left him in no doubt that he was. Following a prolonged torture session, Colin finally ended it by leaving the bag in place until Peter suffocated. As a final twisted touch, he burned his pubic hair to produce a singed smell.
WTF.
He's just depraved.
Yeah. It was while Colin alternated between making sure he hadn't left anything of himself behind and watching TV that he found evidence that Peter had been HIV positive. Enraged and disgusted that Peter hadn't disclosed this because clearly he was the one who had been wronged, Colin shoved knotted condoms into Peter's mouth and nostril and positioned two teddy bears in a 69 position beside his body. Apparently satisfied, Colin went back to cleaning, changed, packed up the cord and his old clothes, then waited. Once 7 o'clock arrived, he left the apartment and blended into the morning crowds on their way to work. Having thrown the keys he stole from Peter's flat from his vantage point on Battersea Bridge into the Thames below, Colin got rid of the cord, shoes, clothes, and gloves by throwing them out a train window and into a canal as he traveled home. When he saw nothing in the papers about Peter's death the next day, Colin called the Samaritans to inform them that he had murdered Peter and had left his dogs locked in a room. In case that didn't motivate someone to get out there, he also dialed the Sun newspaper and asked to be put in touch with an editor. Having gained the attention he was desperately seeking, he recounted his New Year's resolution. Rather than having made an unrealistic plan to achieve a soon to be abandoned goal, Colin had vowed to ring in 1993 with his first kill. Colin taunted the paper by adding that the man he had murdered was gay and enjoyed kinky sex. Touching on the salacious content the newspaper was known for, he said, "You like that stuff, don't you?"
Colin knew he would kill again, but he also knew that without a job, he couldn't afford to keep buying and disposing of new clothes and supplies for each murder. Fortunately for him, he had a solution at hand. All he needed to do was use Peter's debit card to make a withdrawal. Then he'd be free to head back to the pub he had turned into his hunting ground, the Coleherne Arms. As holds true with most serial killers, Colin Ireland's start in life was not a promising one. Pat Ireland was only 17 and worked as a news agent's assistant when she gave birth to Colin at the West Hill Hospital in Dartford, Kent, on March 16, 1954. With no marriage certificate to complicate the process, Colin's father decided he wouldn't be spending the rest of his adolescence caring for a crying baby and left when his son was still very young. Colin would never learn who his disappearing dad had been. His mother never spoke of him and didn't even list his name on her son's birth certificate, choosing to give her son her last name instead.
Pat had barely been scraping by with only one mouth to feed, so she and her newborn son moved in with her parents at Myrtle Road. The pair lived with Colin's maternal grandparents for 5 years until the arrival of some relatives from abroad had Pat yearning for her own place for just the two of them. 5-year-old Colin and 22-year-old Pat began living on their own, but their independence was short lived. With a young child and little work experience, Colin's mother was forced to take part time, low paying work, and they soon found themselves back at her parents' home, where they lived until she had saved enough to leave again the following year. Their move from Dartford to Sidcup went well enough at first, but only a few months later, they sought refuge at West Malling, a camp for women and children experiencing homelessness. It took only 3 months for Pat to decide they would be better off back at Myrtle Road. Considering these many moves, Colin became the permanent new kid. He had gone to 6 different schools by the time he was 10 and hadn't had the chance to make friends at any of them. Tall, thin, and bow-legged, Colin often skipped school to escape his bullies. If he was forced to attend, he'd come in late, which led to him being beaten with a cane as punishment. Ultimately, he gave up on formal education at the age of 13, which seems understandable.
Speaking as someone who has never attended a school with corporal punishment, it sure does. Eager to give her son more stability, by 1961, Pat had begun a relationship with an electrician, and the three started their shared life at Farnell Road. In light of their marriage, Colin took his stepfather's last name of Saker, and the young family lived in Dartford for the next 3 years. Although Saker was decent to Colin, he didn't have a steady job, and the family soon struggled to make ends meet. When they were evicted after failing to pay rent for their place on Farnell Road in 1964, Pat and 10-year-old Colin went to stay at the West Malling camp again, while Saker had to find other accommodations. This was never meant to be a long term solution, but once Pat realized she was pregnant, she placed Colin into foster care until she and Saker could scrape together enough money for a new place where Colin could come and live with them. It didn't take long for them to manage it, and Colin left his foster family in Wainscott to move in with his mother, stepfather, and baby brother in West Kingsdown. While Pat may have been able to save enough for a home to bring her first son back to, the family's financial situation hadn't improved by much. Still, Pat was willing to skip as many meals as it took to have both her boys back with her. But there was nothing she could do to make Saker feel the same way.
Taking a leaf out of Colin's biological father's book, Saker left and never looked back. In dire financial straits again, Pat married the man she had been having an affair with. Colin's new stepfather relocated the family to Clyde Street in Sheerness. Although the family would still be under the same roof 5 years later, 12-year-old Colin didn't have a crystal ball in which to glimpse this future stability and couldn't bring himself to trust the seemingly kind and reliable man. Fearing another flaky father figure, he went back to using the last name of Ireland. As Colin neared adolescence, he had a series of encounters that did nothing to help him on his way to becoming a well adjusted adult. First, he was approached by an older man at the fairground he was working over the summer. This man said he would give Colin a necklace for his mother in exchange for sex. Another pedophile looked over their shared public restroom stall to watch 12-year-old Colin from the neighboring cubicle. Then, at a movie theater, an older man propositioned him. Finally, a male employee at a secondhand shop asked Colin for sex. Colin turned each of these predators down, but his impotent rage grew with each confrontation. I bet it did. He must have felt like he had a sign above his head pointing out his vulnerability.
We do have to take Colin's word for it that these events happened, but pedophiles who act on their urges are disgusting opportunists, so I can believe that they went after any young boy on his own.
That's a good point.
With few happy memories of Kent, 16-year-old Colin decided to make a new life for himself in London. But he didn't have the money to make it happen, so he stole £4. After he was caught, the juvenile court sentenced him to a fit person order, which meant that he was ordered to attend an approved school, the school fees for which would be taken care of by the local county council. When he was bullied for his accent and financial situation, Colin, taking inspiration from his recurring nightmare about fire, sought vengeance by setting one of his bullies' belongings ablaze. The fire was extinguished and Colin wasn't charged, but he was expelled from the school. This punishment left Colin free to pursue his new life in London. This was hardly the fresh start Colin had dreamed of, though. Drawn to the area around the amusement arcade Playland, Colin witnessed pedophiles preying on young runaways who were coerced into abusive situations with the promise of a place to sleep. Without a job or a place to stay of his own, Colin went back to his burgeoning life of crime by turning to robbery. Only a year after he was caught the first time, 17-year-old Colin was apprehended in 1971 and sent to the open borstal of Hoasley Bay Colony.
Forstals were reform institutions that originated after a successful experiment in which 8 juvenile males were separated from the adult population in Bedford Prison in 1900. The name comes from the larger experimental regime at the prison in Borstal in 1902, with the idea that incarcerated minors could avoid becoming career criminals if they were kept away from adults who had gone down that path. The Borstals emphasized hard work and discipline and were eventually replaced by young offenders institutions after the Criminal Justice Act of 1988 was passed. Colin was unimpressed with the vocational training and therapy routine he was expected to follow at Holsley and ran away. After his capture, he finished his sentence in closed, much more secure, i.e., prison like Borstals. He was released at the age of 18 and used his newfound freedom to enter into his first romantic relationship. But getting a girlfriend wasn't enough to set Colin on the straight and narrow for long. At the age of 21, Colin was convicted of property damage, car theft, and 2 counts of burglary in December 1975. He was given an 18-month prison sentence but was released a year later in November 1976. Upon his release, he moved to Swindon, where he began his first sexual relationship with a woman who was 5 years older than him and a single mother to 4 children. Although they started living together and got engaged, the relationship ended when Colin was convicted of demanding with menace or of blackmail in 1977 and handed another 18-month prison sentence.
These many short term prison stints were clearly not changing Colin for the better, because he found himself facing another 2 years inside for a robbery in 1980. Having not served his full sentence, he went back for another 2 months the following year for attempted deception. A free man once more, a few months later, 27-year-old Colin was at a lecture on the topic of survivalism when he ran into 36-year-old disabled sportswoman Virginia Zammit, who started using a wheelchair after a road accident at the age of 24. Similar to his last girlfriend, Virginia was older than him and a single mother to a 5-year-old daughter. The couple built the relationship on their shared interest in survivalism and were married in 1982. As further evidence that killers wear their carefully constructed masks well, after the family made their home in estate housing in Holloway, Colin was nicknamed the Gentle Giant by his neighbors. Even though being a husband and father kept him out of trouble for a few years, in 1985, Colin was given a 6 month prison sentence for going equipped to cheat, which refers to possessing articles for use in fraud, such as a fake ID to get into someone's accounts. Once she learned that her husband had also been unfaithful, Virginia had had enough, and the couple divorced in 1987.
In the periods between his prison stays, Colin took on a variety of positions, including as a volunteer fireman, a chef, and a bouncer. No longer reedy, the bulky Colin threw his weight around while keeping the peace at bars and a gay nightclub. 2 years after his divorce, Colin used his additional free time to check out Janet Young's Devonshire pub in 1989. Less than a week after meeting the single mother of an 11 and 13-year-old, Colin moved into the family home they shared over the business. 3 months later, Janet and Colin got married, and Colin began lending a hand in the running of the pub. In spite, or because, of their relationship's quick progression, the couple didn't stay in the honeymoon phase for long. The couple were in their shared bedroom one night when Colin threw Janet out of the room. She attempted to hide in a nearby bedroom, but Colin followed, showing his true, terrifying colors. Colin broke the light, tiptoed around Janet in the dark, all the while tormenting her by saying, "I'm over here. I'm over here." God, it's like a real life horror movie.
It 100% is. When Colin wasn't terrorizing his wife, he would go to Dartmoor to live out his survivalist fantasy. Or he tried at least. As Janet remembers it, Colin would plan to spend the night in the wilderness where he would hunt down his food and prove his manliness.
Ugh, toxic masculinity at its finest.
For real. In the end, though, he'd either duck into a restaurant while his fellow survivalists braved the cold, or return home with his tail between his legs for tea time. As much as he appreciated his creature comforts, Colin tired of his marriage after only 4 months and snatched his opportunity to leave Janet high and dry when she was visiting friends in London after Easter. When he didn't come to get Janet on Sunday like he had said he would, she frantically called hospitals and police stations, fearing that he had been in an accident. It was only once Janet returned home that she realized Colin had used her time away to empty their home and her bank account. Having used Janet's PIN number to clean her out, Colin would rely on this same act of fraud to finance his future crimes. In the wake of Colin's betrayal, Janet was left with nothing. She didn't even have enough to pay for the bus home. She and her 2 children were left to seek refuge in a hostel for those experiencing homelessness. Although Colin never reached out to Janet again, his circumstances mirrored the woman he had left destitute. Homeless himself, he worked as a relief manager in a night shelter for those in the same situation in Southend-on-Sea, a coastal town in Essex. Richard Higgs, his manager, remembered Colin's troubling offer to do away with a difficult repeat client. At first, as is often the case, Richard thought he was joking and went along with it, asking how he'd get rid of him. Colin didn't crack a smile as he said he'd shove snooker balls down his throat. To add to the concerns of those in the shelter, Colin then inappropriately touched several female coworkers. Although he argued with the owners, he ultimately resigned in November 1992.
Colin's next short term job consisted of breaking down wooden pallets for a charity. He may have been nearing 40, but Colin didn't have much to show for his years on Earth. Instead of turning his life of crime around, however, Colin decided it was time to up the ante. Having made his New Year's resolution to kill someone, in his spare time, Colin studied what he saw as the masters of their craft, serial killers. He read former FBI agent Robert Ressler's Whoever Fights Monsters and watched the TV crime show The Bill. From sources like these, he learned that most criminals commit their crimes somewhat close to home, which allowed investigators to track killers down with geographic profiling. To avoid this pitfall, Colin stayed far away from Southend-on-Sea by choosing to make the approximately 40-mile repeat journey to London. He would tell his former manager, Richard, that he was going on survivalist camping trips and needed to store his stuff with him rather than risk it being stolen from the bedsit he was staying in. But Colin didn't go to the woods on these weekends away. He went to the Coleherne pub. It was on one of these trips that he put his murderous plan into action and took the life of Peter Walker. Colin had assumed that the absence of any stories related to Peter's murder meant that his body hadn't yet been found. But in reality, the building caretaker had already discovered Peter's corpse by the time Colin was impatiently calling the Samaritans and the Sun the day after the killing. Detective Inspector Martin Finnegan was one of the first detectives on the scene and the one who would ultimately take the lead on the case. He noticed the ligature marks on Peter's wrist and ankles, but saw that whatever had been used to bind him was missing. There was hardly any forensic evidence to go on, but authorities knew from the killer's attention seeking calls that he would likely strike again. So Detective Finnegan made a televised appeal.
His pleas for witnesses to come forward largely fell on deaf ears, thanks to the decision made by the House of Lords on March 11th to criminalize S&M if bodily harm occurred, even when it took place between consenting adults. Members of this community weren't just afraid of being prosecuted. They had good reason to believe that the police were ready to act on their homophobia. They knew all about the glove wearing officers who raided gay pubs while worrying they would catch AIDS.
Medical professionals knew for certain 10 years earlier that AIDS couldn't be transmitted by casual contact or from touching someone who was infected. Also, this was years after Princess Diana touched AIDS patients sans gloves. Heaven forbid someone in an authority position have actual facts.
It's not like the information was kept secret. Some people just couldn't get past their own fear and prejudice. 10 weeks into the rapidly cooling investigation into Peter's murder, Colin felt confident enough to go back to the Coleherne Arms on May 28th, 1993. Once inside, he started talking to 37-year-old Christopher Dunn, a council librarian at Willesden Green Library in the London borough of Brent. Christopher was a loyal pub patron who told Colin of his desire to be dominated. That was all the wannabe serial killer needed to hear. The two left the pub via the side door and headed to Christopher's flat in Willesden, North London. They had a bite to eat and watched an S&M movie Christopher owned to get in the mood. After the credits rolled, Christopher headed to the bedroom to undress. Colin came in a short time later and had Christopher lie face down in his studded belt and leather body harness. Reveling in the knowledge that the night's main events were about to start, he handcuffed Christopher and bound his feet together.
As with Peter, it didn't take long for Christopher to realize that Colin wasn't interested in a night of consensual sex. Colin showed his hand when he began beating Christopher with his fist and a belt while ordering him to give up his bank card and PIN number. Even though Christopher didn't resist, Colin thought he was lying about his PIN because three of the four numbers were the same. To make sure Christopher wasn't playing him, Colin burned Christopher's testicles with the flame of his lighter and continued to hit him. Once he was convinced that he had the real PIN number, Colin strangled Christopher with a length of cord. While removing all of the forensic evidence from the apartment, Colin packed his earlier plate and glass into his bag and took inspiration from a TV show he had seen in going to the effort to wipe his fingerprints from the flashlight batteries he had touched. With the clothes and shoes he had been wearing in the bag he planned to throw from another train, Colin once again waited until he could slip onto the street unnoticed. The corpse that Colin had tried not to look at in those early morning hours was found 2 days later by Christopher's friend.
Police quickly responded to the call. However, having learned that Christopher frequented pubs like the Coleherne, authorities believed that the gay man's death was a result of a sex game gone wrong. Oh, how I fucking hate that phrase.
Yeah, me too. It always makes me think of what the media referred to as the preppy murder when Jennifer Levin was murdered by Robert Chambers in 1986, and the attorneys argued the rough sex defense.
I hadn't heard of that case specifically, but I've definitely heard of that disgusting defense. Apparently, the pathologist wasn't positive about the cause of death and said it could have resulted from a consensual sex act. This inaccurate conclusion garnered Christopher's passing hardly a mention in the local paper. Even though Christopher and Peter had both spent the last nights of their lives in the Coleherne, because they lived in different areas of London, their cases were investigated by separate local teams of detectives who weren't in the habit of comparing cases. So their deaths weren't connected. It wasn't until authorities realized that someone had withdrawn £200 from Christopher's bank account — Colin needed money to buy supplies for his next kill after all — that the police began to believe that they were looking at a murder and a robbery in which Christopher had been tortured for his pin. But without forensic evidence, they weren't making much progress.
Colin's frustration that the police hadn't yet realized they were investigating a serial killer was mounting. So, only 6 days after he murdered Christopher, Colin went back to the Coleherne on June 4th. On his third visit to the pub, he met 35-year-old Perry Bradley III, the son of deceased U.S. Congressman Perry Bradley Jr. Perry was a successful American businessman who could afford to have a flat in the Kensington area the pub called home. After he and Colin got back to Perry's apartment, Perry stripped down and Colin offered to tie him up. When Perry said he wasn't on board with being restrained, Colin pushed harder by claiming he couldn't perform without bondage foreplay. So Perry reluctantly agreed, and Colin had him lie face down on his bed with his hands behind his back.
Once Colin had handcuffed him and bound his feet with a cord, he slipped a noose around Perry's neck, then said he'd kill him if he didn't provide his bank card and PIN. In case that wasn't enough of an incentive, Colin threatened to hold his lighter to Perry's testicles as he had done to Christopher. Beyond terrified, Perry not only told him his PIN and the location of the card, but he also said he'd go with Colin to make the withdrawal. Colin, though, wasn't interested in the offer and told Perry that he was in for a long night and should try to sleep. After Perry managed to fall asleep, and he would kind of hope that you would shut down in that situation, Colin debated letting Perry go, but ultimately chose to follow his familiar pattern of murdering the man he had gone home with. Decision made, he snuck up on the sleeping Perry and tightened the noose until he stopped struggling. After Colin strangled Perry, he made a sandwich, cleaned the apartment, pocketed the 100 pounds he spotted, then listened to the radio until he could disappear into the morning rush hour. Before he walked out of the apartment, Colin positioned a doll on Perry's body in the hope that his murder would be connected to Peter's, leading the police to realize a serial killer was targeting the gay community. Having taken out 200 pounds of Perry's debit card, Colin continued covering his tracks by again throwing the forensic evidence out a train window nearer to Southend-on-Sea, then London, to disconnect it from the crime scene he had just left.
Despite Colin's intent, when Perry's body was discovered on June 7th, his murder wasn't initially linked to Peter's or Christopher's, both because it was in a different part of London and because no one close to Perry had known he was gay. When Brian Edwards, the senior investigating officer on Perry's case, reached out to his family, they weren't aware of his interest in men. Similarly, after word of his death and the circumstances surrounding it made it back to America, people were quick to label it a random attack and mention Perry's well known admiration for beautiful women. Although his family's political background ensured his case got a prime spot in the papers, because his suspected sexual orientation wasn't shared, Colin was left fuming that none of the cases had yet been connected. The similarities would only become apparent once the Metropolitan Police learned that Perry had also been drinking at the Coleherne and had had his bank card stolen. But with Colin's shortening cooling off period, the police weren't connecting the dots as quickly as Colin's urge to kill was resurfacing. 3 days after strangling Perry, Colin walked back into the Coleherne Arms on June 7th, only hours after his last victim had been found. This time he went after 33-year-old Andrew Collier, who served as the warden of a sheltered housing complex in Dalston in East London. They had just made it back to Andrew's apartment when they heard noises coming from outside. It seemed that a fight had broken out on the street around 1 a.m. The men tried to get a glimpse of what was going on at the window, but soon resumed their evening.
As was becoming his preferred practice, Colin handcuffed and secured Andrew to the bed and placed a noose around his neck. Having restrained Andrew, Colin demanded his debit card and PIN number. But Andrew wasn't just about to give them up. So Colin went through his things to find them himself. Instead, he discovered a notification that stated that Andrew was HIV positive. Just like when he had learned of Peter's diagnosis, red obscured Colin's vision. Channeling his rage into cruelty, he tortured Andrew by holding his lighter against various parts of the bound man's body. The physical torture soon turned psychological. And trigger warning here, there's some animal abuse, so feel free to skip ahead. Colin was so incensed that he cornered Andrew's cat, Millie, and strangled her in front of Andrew. Colin then repeated this act of barbarity by strangling Andrew with a noose. After Andrew was dead, Colin defiled his and his cat's corpses. In a crude approximation of the teddy bears in a 69 position at Peter's apartment, he put condoms on Andrew's penis and Millie's tail before placing the cat on Andrew's chest so that its tail was in Andrew's mouth and Andrew's penis was in Millie's mouth.
God, he's such a horrific piece of shit. I'm going to try really hard to block that information from my mind.
As am I, although my hopes aren't high. Colin then grabbed the 70 pounds he had dug up and cleaned away any traces of himself from the crime scene. which included bagging a mug he had drunk from. Having stayed inside the apartment until the streets were packed with people, he wended his way through the crowds and disappeared into the London morning.
As horrific as the staged crime scene was, it was also the first at which Colin made a mistake. When Colin had looked out of the window earlier, he had unthinkingly put one of his fingers on the bar that ran across it and hadn't remembered to remove the print before he left. With the posed nature of the bodies as a clear indication that this was without a doubt a murder and not a sex game gone wrong, Detective Superintendent Albert Patrick started digging and learned about the street fight. He concluded that anyone who heard loud noises in the early morning would most likely check it out. With this idea in mind, detectives went to the window and managed to lift a fingerprint from the bar between the glass panes. But this was only 1993, and in the absence of a computerized database containing Colin's fingerprints from his past crimes, they had nothing to compare it to, which is unfortunate, but that was good police work.
It was. D.S. Patrick is putting in the work. And police did manage to make some headway on the case. By June 14th, the sexually explicit manner in which the teddy bears and Millie had been laid out at Peter Walker's and Andrew Collier's crime scenes allowed investigators to connect at least two of the murders. But it would be Colin himself who backed up the detective's suspicions that they were dealing with an increasingly prolific serial killer. 5 days after killing Andrew on June 12th, Colin anonymously rang the Kensington police, then their Battersea counterparts. He told them that he had murdered 4 men and needed to be stopped. Having provided details about Millie to prove his involvement in Andrew's murder, he asked why the investigation into Peter Walker's death hadn't gone anywhere, implied that the police didn't care about the case because he was gay, and warned that he would take another life in his quest to carry out the perfect murder.
Eager to achieve that goal, later that night, Colin struck up a conversation with 41-year-old Emanuel Spiteri at the Coleherne, but the Maltese born chef ultimately left on his own. However, Colin ran into Emanuel again at Earl's Court Tube Station, and this chat ended with them heading back to Emanuel's Catford apartment in southeast London. Once Colin had Emanuel handcuffed and tied to his bed, he slipped a noose around his neck and ordered him to give up his bank card and PIN. When Emanuel wouldn't give up the code, Colin fell back on his preferred form of asphyxiation by tightening the noose until Emanuel died from strangulation. Colin killed the early morning hours by eating, watching some TV, and cleaning the crime scene. But before he headed out, he chose to channel the pyromania he had exhibited in his youth. With the hope that the fire would spread, he collected some papers, laid them on the floor in the bedroom, then left once the flame caught and he was sure he wouldn't be spotted leaving the apartment. Fortunately, his decision not to turn on the gas meant that the blaze never left the bedroom and went out on its own shortly after Colin had let himself out, resulting in minimal damage.
3 days after murdering Emmanuel, Colin, who had no idea that the fire hadn't burned down the entire apartment complex like he had intended, called the Arbor Square police in East London on the evening of June 15th. He told them that they would find a body in a fire in South London. He also shared his plans to quit while he was ahead, saying, "I have read a lot of books on serial killers. I think it is from 4 people that the FBI classes serial, so I may stop now I have done 5." As investigators combed through fire reports, another call came in, this time from Emmanuel's landlady. She had discovered her tenant's body and the remnants of the fire. Finally, the police were able to connect all 5 deaths to the same serial killer who had been using the Coleherne Arms to prey on the gay community. Armed with this information, authorities understandably didn't trust the caller's claim that he was set to retire. So they launched a surveillance operation at the Coleherne and held a midnight press conference to put the gay community on their guard in the hope that the next potential victim might hear the warning and escape the killer's clutches. Scotland Yard asked the victims' loved ones and other members of the gay community to contact either them or Gallup an LGBTQ plus anti abuse charity that offered anonymity to anyone who came forward. Having investigated Andrew's case and learned that Peter was also HIV positive, DS Albert Patrick introduced a possible motive to the public in speculating that the killer could be HIV positive and driven by revenge.
In a follow up press conference on June 17th, Detective Chief Superintendent Ken John, who was leading the inquiry, spoke directly to the killer in an attempt to convince him to hand himself in. Along with asking reporters to avoid taunting this volatile man and triggering a violent response, he told them that the police had received calls describing the murders, which he took as a cry for help. 2 days later, police officers stationed themselves at London's Gay Pride Festival to distribute leaflets among the more than 50,000 gay men in attendance. In addition to detailing the 5 murders, the leaflets appealed for information and warned the community to be wary of their interactions with people they didn't know well. As interested in preventing more deaths as they were in catching the culprit, police also sought witnesses at gay bars and drafted gay officers to advise investigators. Authorities attempted to narrow their suspect pool by focusing on their killer's motivation. Having sought out the advice of various experts, including from Colin's preferred author, pioneering FBI profiler Robert Ressler, who was in the UK for a book tour, the police went to work on obtaining a profile of their killer. According to psychologists Mike Berry and Jonas Rappaport, the killer would be looking to live out a violent fantasy through the murders, but each kill fell short of his imagination, so he continued killing. He was simply posing as a gay man to prey on a vulnerable community who was often targeted rather than protected by the police, and who would, at least initially, consent to bondage.
And authorities were lucky enough to get a physical description, too. Their appeals for information resulted in the statement of a witness who remembered seeing Emanuel the night of his murder on the train he was taking to the Hither Green station on his way to Catford. More to the point, this witness also remembered what the man with him had looked like. They provided a description of a clean shaven white man between the ages of 30 and 40 who was over 6 feet tall and had short, dirty, dark brown hair, stained teeth, and a full face. Along with releasing the witness's depiction of the killer to the public, the police used it to create an EFIT, or electronic facial identification technique, likeness that they also gave to the press. Now that they knew where to look, investigators were able to get a hold of the British Rail security camera film. Even though the police were facing down 450 hours of recorded footage, it only took around 10 hours for them to spot Emmanuel and Colin. Although the image was blurry and half of Emmanuel's killer was missing from the shot, on July 2nd, authorities put the picture onto a wanted poster with a request for information. The very next day, more than 40 calls came in, including from men who had either seen or spoken with this man at the Coleherne Arms.
Although Colin had returned to Southend-on-Sea, he hadn't gone far enough to avoid being recognized. Several acquaintances commented that he looked a hell of a lot like the image of the gay serial killer that police had released. Their remarks must have been ringing in his ears because Colin decided that his best bet was to come forward on his own with a pre prepared narrative. With all of the time in the world, as an unemployed, supposedly former serial killer, he visited his solicitor on July 19th and agreed to sign an affidavit that described his night with Emmanuel. In Colin's version of events, he walked into Emmanuel's apartment to see another man already there. Uninterested in a threesome, Colin walked right back out of the door, leaving Emmanuel alive and alone with his presumed killer. By the time that Colin was trying to sell this story, authorities already knew that he was the man they were looking for. When his solicitor phoned the police, they were on their way to Southend-on-Sea. Fortunately, this meant that they weren't fooled by Colin's claims of innocence, and they arrested him. Once they had taken him to the Islington police station in London, Colin clammed up. In spite of his 2 days stoic silence, the police were able to get what they needed from his fingerprints.
Having confirmed that the preserved fingerprint from Andrew's window belonged to the man they had arrested, authorities had enough to charge 39-year-old Colin Ireland with Andrew Collier's murder on July 21st, 1993. He was charged with Emanuel Spiteri's murder 2 days later. Aware that Colin prided himself on being a serial killer, the police bided their time with the attention seeker safely behind bars. And soon, Colin's need for recognition overpowered his sense of self preservation. He came back from the magistrate's court a month later, ready to confess. On August 19th, Colin confessed to murdering all 5 men. Although he admitted his crimes dispassionately and agreed that the only way he wouldn't kill again was if he was locked in a cell, he did want to make a few things clear. Colin simultaneously shut down D.S. Albert Patrick's theory that he had been seeking revenge and proved that the psychologists had been spot on in their profile when he clarified that he was straight and had only targeted gay men because he saw them as easy pickings. He even added, it might as well have been women.
Nice.
As we've repeatedly seen, he's a real class act. While he might not have had any ill will toward the community, more broadly, he had a hatred for humanity that stemmed from being bullied as a child.
That hatred would go on to solidify into an urge to kill. Even though Colin fully recognized that the men who had preyed on him when he was younger were pedophiles, not gay, those encounters had triggered his murderous rage and produced his need for power and recognition. In saying that this need served as his motive, he stressed the fact that along with not being intoxicated, he had never engaged in any sexual activity with the 5 men or derived any sexual thrill from the killings. However, he did admit to being a sadist and compared killing Peter to having sex for the first time. Lovely. As further as further testament to the time he spent navel gazing, Colin was able to identify his obsession with fire when it came to torturing his victims and interfering with the crime scenes, admitting, I once worked as a fireman. There is a bit of an arsonist in all firemen. I think there is something in me that's highly destructive. In some moods, I would be quite happy to burn the world down. Nonetheless, his clarifications don't make him any less of a depraved and dangerous individual, and luckily the sentencing judge agreed.
The day after his confession, Colin was also charged with the murders of Peter Walker, Christopher Dunn, and Perry Bradley III. 3 months later, on December 20th, 1993, Colin Ireland left the Old Bailey's #1 court facing 5 counts of life imprisonment. The hordes of press at his 2-hour sentencing hearing proved that Colin unfortunately got his wish in being recognized as a serial killer. That said, his decision to confess and plead guilty meant that he missed out on the publicity that surrounds the nail biting wait for a verdict. Instead, he succeeded in getting his name etched onto the short list of whole life tariff prisoners. As we mentioned in our episode on Alison Firth, in the UK, a whole life order, which precludes the prisoner from ever becoming eligible for parole, is incredibly rare and reserved for the worst of the worst. As of March 2025, there were only around 70 prisoners whose crimes were serious enough to earn them a spot on that selective list. Ultimately, though, Colin served less than 20 years of that sentence. After he fell and fractured his hip in the Wakefield prison yard in West Yorkshire, 57-year-old Colin Ireland died in the prison's healthcare center 10 days later from natural causes at 9:20 in the morning on February 21st, 2012.
In the wake of Colin's admission to being the so called gay slayer, the police were forced to address their history of shrugging off homophobic hate crime. Beyond actually investigating these crimes, the department would go on to hire LGBT liaison officers. Still, those changes couldn't turn back time and give justice to all of the victims and their loved ones. In May 2007, a report written by the Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Transgender Advisory Group reviewed the murders of 10 members of the LGBTQ plus community, 4 of which remain unsolved. This report found that historically, Scotland Yard has exhibited institutional homophobia and transphobia that was reflected and encouraged in the press coverage of the cases. In examining Colin Ireland's case, it was determined that the Metropolitan Police investigation was hampered by a lack of knowledge of the gay scene in London and the special culture of S&M bondage, as it wasn't until after Andrew's murder that the crime scenes were connected and the Coleherne, which has now been replaced by the gastropub, the Pembroke, was established as the place in which Colin had met each of the men. The report concluded that the inadequate warning issued to the community was a serious failure of policing. Yet, these major missteps and the overall findings of institutional homophobia were hardly surprising, since it wasn't until 2013 that importuning, which was regularly used against gay men for seeking consensual sex, was repealed.
All right, everyone, that was a rough one. Next time, we'll be continuing our series on serial killers who targeted gay men in the 90s when we discuss the case of Gary Ray Bowles.
All the sources we used for this episode are in the show notes below. If you'd like to suggest a case or theme for us to discuss, you can email us at terrifyinglytypicalpodcast@gmail.com. You can also follow us at Terrifying the Typical Podcast on Instagram and at Terrifying the Typical Pod on TikTok. Feel free to leave us a comment, rating, or review to let us know what you think. We'd love to hear your opinions.
See you next time.